YCS is a grassroots environmental not-for-profit organization that was established in 1968, and through a broad program of conservation education, input into public policy, and participating in public review processes, we strive to ensure that Yukon's natural resources are managed wisely and that development is informed by environmental considerations. The Yukon Conservation Society has been involved with energy issues and opportunities in the Yukon for more than a decade. Energy is one of our priority areas. We have an active energy committee and 2 energy analysts. We've participated in every energy and climate change policy related government consultation, intervened at the Yukon Utilities Board, and submitted comments to YESUB on energy projects. We've been an active participant at the Yukon Energy Partners Table and more recently the Yukon Energy Corporation Advisory Committee on the Asiac Relicensing Program. YCS strives to help inform the public about the risks and benefits of energy development and consumption. We played an integral role in the formation of the Select Committee regarding the risks and benefits of hydraulic fracturing, and we spearheaded and launched Yukon Energy Solutions, the YES project and website, and are currently investigating how we can help encourage and stimulate economic development with renewable energy projects to meet environmental and social goals as well as economic objectives. So you might be wondering why an energy analyst is organizing a caribou event. What is the connection between the Porcupine Caribou Herd and energy? Well, that is the nature of my presentation this morning. As I explored the impacts of oil and gas development in the Yukon, particularly at Eagle Plain, I came to realize that it's not just our future at stake, but that of the Porcupine Caribou Herd as well. As Joe mentioned, all across Canada, barren ground caribou herds are declining, partly due to development-related disturbances. The Porcupine Caribou Herd is almost unique in that it is still healthy. It is healthy because of good management by extraordinary groups such as the Porcupine Caribou Management Board, and extraordinary efforts by people such as the Gwitchin and the Inuvialuit. And it's also healthy because of a certain amount of luck. Now, if we can shift our focus, I thought, from exploiting non-renewable and polluting energy resources to clean renewables, not only will our society thrive, but so too will the Porcupine Caribou Herd. So in this presentation, I'm going to try and show the connection between oil and gas development and the Porcupine Caribou Herd, how the herd is impacted by oil and gas development, and why the Yukon Conservation Society has concluded that developing oil and gas industries in the Yukon is a bad idea, and what we propose to do as an alternative to developing oil and gas in the Porcupine Caribou Herd habitat. So, a little context before I talk more about the connection between energy and caribou. This map here shows the range of the Porcupine Caribou Herd. It's partly in Alaska, and it's partly in the Yukon, and it covers almost the northern third of. And it's, I did know that. Make sure that I need to figure out how this thing works. Well, we're going to need it later. There we go. Okay. I'm going to need it. You won't understand me otherwise. Okay. All right. Okay. The next 2 maps come from the Porcupine Caribou Management Board website. So this is a closer view of the Porcupine Caribou Herd range. As you can see, about half of the range is in Alaska, and about half of it is in the Yukon. Something that I think is I should mention that, here's Old Crow, as Joe mentioned, strategically located in the middle of the range. Here's Dawson City to the south, and the Dempster Highway extending right through the middle of the range there, Tombstone Park. And this would be the Peel watershed boundary here. Of interest is these green areas, which are areas that have been protected one way or another. What I think is really interesting is that in the Alaskan side of the range, most of their range is under some level of protection from the Arctic National Wildlife Refuge. We know that the 10,002 lands, which are up here, have a different status and that are under threat right now. In the Yukon, we do have some parks that do protect, and other selections that do protect some of the range. The wintering range of the porcupine caribou is the southern half of their range, approximately. And you'll notice that the wintering range of the porcupine caribou herd in the Yukon is almost entirely unprotected, except for parts of Fishing Branch Park and Tombstone Park. Did that just go back? I'm sorry. This is not the computer I'm used to using, and I rehearsed this like crazy, and now I am. There we go. Okay, so this slide is intended to show the sum total of human disturbance over the past 50 years within the range of the porcupine caribou herd. It's the same map as the last slide with human disturbance overlaid. It helps explain what the level of protection means on the land. The pink lines are trails. So these are trails. This is a trail. This is the Dempster Highway. These green lines are cut lines. These dark gray ones are seismic lines. So most of the development that you can see here is in the Eagle Plain region. Here's Fishing Branch Park, Dawson, Old Crow, and the Dempster Highway, which is also, of course, a disturbance. With the status of, although the oil industry has put quite a big footprint on the ground, it's not terribly active right now. By far the most active piece of disturbance in the Yukon side of the range is the Dempster Highway. Okay, I want to talk about Northern Cross, because Northern Cross is an oil company that has acquired all of the petroleum leases in the Eagle Plain area. It's drilled 4 wells there. It's explored for more with an extensive seismic program, and it's applied to drill 20 more wells. This last application was referred to a more in-depth environmental assessment because they didn't present enough information about the effects of the project on caribou and the effects of the project on the harvesting of caribou. Northern Cross is currently suing Canada to overturn that referral. The case will be heard here in Whitehorse starting Monday. It's a 3-day court case. And it just launched another lawsuit against the Yukon this time because it says it wants to frack at Eagle Plain and can't. Okay, so I want to zoom in on the footprint. This is a rather busy map. It's courtesy of the Yukon Oil and Gas Branch, and it shows where the oil company Northern Cross has its leases, and that's this area here. This is the Dempster Highway running through here. This is Fishing Branch Park. This dark green area is the Peel watershed. So what it shows is the Northern Cross leases that it's acquired. The other thing it shows is the results of the latest request for postings, which happened last July. And the way that oil interests are assigned in the Yukon is that Twice a year, the government issues a request for oil companies to express interests in different parts of the Yukon. And last July, some oil company or companies said that they were interested in exploring in this area of the Kandik Basin and this part of the Eagle Plain Basin. And there is consultation taking place right now between the Yukon government and First Nations, and soon there will be consultations taking place with the wider community. What I want to address, what I think is interesting here is that it kind of backs up from the previous slide, what I was saying there, where the oil and gas interests are starting to cover a fair amount of the wintering range of the Porcupine Caribou Herd. We don't know what's going to happen with the Peel Watershed Planning Region right now, and we haven't developed a plan for the Dawson Planning Region, so things could change in the future. This map is supposed to show why it matters, why people are concerned about the oil and gas development in the wintering range. This map shows the areas that are most heavily used in the wintertime by the Porcupine Caribou Herd. So it shows the northern gas oil dispositions here. It shows the Dempster Highway, Dawson City, Old Crow. The darker the area, the more heavily used it is. So what this is, it's a snapshot of winter use between October and March from 1997 to 2012, I believe. So they measure this from locations from the caribou, from the satellite collars on the caribou, and the more often they record it, the darker the colors go. So what I want to draw your attention to is a couple of things. One is the oil and gas dispositions of Northern Cross, and the other are the recent requests for proposals in this area. The thing that concerns me is not so much the fact that they overlap some rather high use areas, but they also potentially act as a kind of a barrier for the caribou when they migrate south to their wintering range. They're going to have to pass over some of these highly developed areas, or potentially highly developed areas. Okay, so this, I think, is an interesting image. This image, too, comes from the Porcupine Caribou Management Board website. And it is a snapshot of 1 week in October in 2015. Each one of these symbols indicates a collared caribou. So the technical committee of the Porcupine Caribou Management Board, the biologists in the Yukon and the Northwest Territories and Alaska, they put satellite collars on a sample of the caribou to help give an idea of where the caribou are at any particular time and how they are moving. On the Porcupine Caribou Management Board website, you can look at a series of these maps which show week by week how the caribou are moving. So in June, all of the cows and the calves are up here in the calving grounds. The males are mostly up in the Richardsons, and then as the summer progresses, they start to move south. And in the fall, these guys were all moving rapidly down towards their wintering range. But you'll notice here that the Dempster Highway happens to run right along the edge of where the caribou have migrated to. And remember where the Northern Cross oil dispositions are. So this particular time within the project area of Northern Cross's oil development, There were about 50,000 caribou at that time. The other thing that I think is of interest is how the Dempster Highway acts as a sort of a temporary barrier to the migration of the caribou. Obviously, they do cross the Dempster Highway, but you can see clearly here, I think, that it has an effect on their migration. Rivers have an effect on their migration as well, but the Dempster Highway does in a different way. Earlier I mentioned that as part of Northern Cross's work they'd done some seismic exploration. Seismic exploration is when they lay out explosive charges at intervals on a grid laid out over the area they're interested in. They set off the charges and then they read the way that the shock waves propagate through the different layers of rock. This picture helps give us an idea of how modern 3D seismic grids appear from the air. These are intended to be lower impact than the old ones that still scar the landscape, but the sheer density of the lines from 3D seismic is a concern. This image was taken from Jerry Whitley's light plane. It was taken by Yannick Chou, and it was through the courtesy of Lighthawk, a environmental organization that helps groups like Yukon Conservation Society get up in the air and take a bird's eye view of things. This picture is looking east towards the Dempster Highway here, and these are the 3D seismic lines in this fairly tightly spaced grid. What we can see here is the scars from the old 2D seismic. So, what could happen at Eagle Plain if the dreams of the oil companies do come true? Well, we know that there would be at least 24 oil rigs, the four wells that are currently there right now, plus also another 20 that Northern Cross wants to develop. There'd need to be feeder pipelines connecting the different rigs and collecting the oil. There'd need to be plenty of infrastructure related to gathering and shipping the oil and gas. Now, the stuff that comes out of the ground is crude oil or gas, and it has to be separated into useful products like diesel, gasoline, etc. before it can be used. It needs to be refined. So there's actually a proposal for a micro refinery at Eagle Plain. So this image is of a type of micro refinery that is in the Bakken oil fields in North Dakota. It's a place called Prairie Creek. It's the type of refinery that is proposed for Eagle Plain. Last year, Northern Cross Yukon and the Yukon Chamber of Commerce's Energy Committee proposed the construction of this type of refinery to process Eagle Plain crude into diesel fuel for local use and for export. These refineries are not cheap. They run about $500 million. Once a refinery is built, that's just the start of things. There would be a pipeline next to ship the product south, and pretty soon Eagle Plain would start to look like northern British Columbia with pipelines and oil rigs everywhere. We can't afford to let that happen. Not here, where some of the Earth's last viable caribou populations have the best chance of adapting to our changing climate and continuing to help the survival of the Gwitchin and Inuvialuit people. So these are the reasons why Yukon Conservation Society is saying no to oil and gas in the Yukon, period. There is a risk that the Porcupine Caribou Herd could collapse like so many other herds. Oil and gas development harms the water, the air, the land, and most importantly, our climate globally. It is unsustainable, and in the Yukon, it's probably uneconomic, and we have better alternatives. So, we've seen how fossil fuel exploration, development, and build-out threatens caribou habitat, but we use energy, and we need jobs. It's one thing to say what we don't want, but it's another thing altogether to come up with alternatives. However, Yukon Conservation Society and others have been actively exploring alternatives and finding ways to make a non-fossil fuel economy a reality in the Yukon. We think that the low-hanging fruit of an energy transition away from fossil fuels is energy and conservation. The first step is to reduce our energy needs and reduce waste. However, alongside reducing our energy consumption, we have to replace imported fossil fuels with local renewable energy sources. And I want to take a moment to share some exciting energy projects that we see leading to a brighter, lower impact and more sustainable future. And the next set of slides talks about a few of these projects. The Vuntut Gwitchin First Nation has been a leader in the Yukon for solar technology. This picture is of the Don Tija Cultural Center, which had a 3.3 kilowatt system installed back in 2009. A year later, the Arctic Research Facility got a 12 kilowatt system, which was at the time one of the largest, if not the largest, solar energy system in the Yukon. Both of these buildings and solar installations are owned by the Vuntut Gwitchin First Nation government. And now the Vuntut Gwitchin have plans for a solar battery project that will reduce the diesel burned to generate electricity in Old Crow. It will be the largest solar installation in the Yukon, with the potential to displace 100,000 litres of diesel that is currently flown into Old Crow. This 330 kilowatt system will cost a couple of $1 million, so the First Nation is currently looking for funding partners and negotiating a power purchase agreement with their electricity supplier, ATCO. Brandon Kikavitchuk is presenting tomorrow, and he made a little film about this project, so if you bump into him tomorrow, you can probably ask him more questions about this. This computer is slow. Okay, the Yukon government's microgeneration program provides incentives for rooftop solar. Here is an early example. It is renewable energy pioneer John Mason's Whitehorse home. There are lots of solar installations currently feeding electricity into the grid in the Yukon through the government's microgeneration program. The program reduces electricity bills and provides a return for many small households and small businesses across the Yukon. We're still in the early days of connecting solar to the grid. It is proving viable, and it's growing exponentially. These are just a few examples of projects in the Yukon. I want to show you a couple more from the Northwest Territories. This one is in Lutzel Cay. It's a community on Great Slave Lake. It's a fly-in diesel-powered community, similar to Old Crow in that sense. And it became the first independent power producer in the Northwest Territories with its 35 kilowatt solar project that provides about 20% of the annual electricity needs of its community. They have a power purchase agreement with the Northwest Territories Power Corp, similar to the one that Vuntut will have with ATCO. And this next project is at Colville Lake, which is northeast of Norman Wells, just north of the Arctic Circle. And it's a solar, battery, and diesel plant that has been designed to produce, at times, more electricity than the community currently uses. So it includes batteries to store the excess. And on an annual basis, it produces about 20% of the community's electricity needs. So in the summertime, when the sun's shining, it produces more electricity than they need. And the batteries try to help keep up for later in the season. In the Yukon, the winds blow strongest in the winter, which makes wind a really good supplement to hydro in the darkest time of year. The Kluane First Nation has a 300 kilowatt wind project in advanced planning, and the interest in wind in the Yukon is surging at the moment. In May, a new project on Heckle Hill will commence its environmental assessment. It's nice to see that project getting refurbished. So this is why the Yukon Conservation Society energy folks are concerned about the Porcupine Caribou herd. The caribou are very sensitive to disturbance, not just in the Arctic refuge, but in their winter habitat too. Joe Tedlici talked about how the Porcupine Caribou Management Board is concerned about this too. If the oil companies get their way, the disturbance footprint would get much bigger and much, much busier. I hope that I've illustrated the caribou energy link and some of the ways that we can act to reduce the threat to the caribou habitat. Today and tomorrow, we're going to hear more about how the caribou live and how they thrive in the north, how they've been affected by disturbances in other places, and what lessons we have learned. We shall hear about how the Gwitchin have coexisted with the caribou for tens of thousands of years. We shall learn some very old ways of using and eating caribou, and I hope that you will be as enthralled by the presentations, films, discussions, and activities as I am excited about bringing them to you. So thank you very much for coming and for celebrating the caribou. We've got a couple of minutes for questions if anybody wants to ask a question.
Actually, it's not a question, it's a comment. I think Sebastian showed us some really exciting renewable things that are and can happen with certain amounts of millions of dollars. I would like to encourage all of the Yukoners that are here and people who aren't here to tell our government that we don't want them settling out of court with Northern Cross for whatever it is, $2.2 billion, that there's better things to spend that money on. And Northern Cross hasn't got a foot to stand on, so let's spend it on something we can be proud of. It's our money, after all.
Hear, hear.
I too don't have a question, but I have a comment. We should be proud of the energy, the solar energy project, which supplies energy to the Tombstone Interpretive Center.
We should. I agree. Yeah, that was a fairly innovative thing. When they built the new Tombstone Interpretive Center, they set up a fairly sophisticated solar system there. The center is designed to run entirely on solar. It's got a pretty substantial battery bank that's in a trailer, so that in the wintertime when the center's not open, they actually truck the trailer to Dawson and plug it in to keep it charged up all winter. Works pretty good.
Question in the back.
Actually, it's not a question, it's just a comment. Like in our community in Aklavik, we have a new solar project for the municipality. Also, besides sitting on the Porcupine Caribou Management Board, I also sit on the municipal council. And all of our buildings, public buildings now have solar power. They're all solar powered. And we have a new agreement with the Northwest Territories Power Corporation, and we've put in, I don't know how many kilowatt system, but it's a big line of solar panels. And the only thing different about ours is that it produces the energy, but it also we also have an agreement with the NWT Power Corporation that they've put in a new type of diesel engine that's a variable. So when there's, like, usually engines run at 2100 RPM and they stay that way all day, so they burn a lot of fuel. So now they have the variable speed engines where they don't have to rev them up. The load is taken by the solar panels, so the engines don't even have to idle up sometimes. So that's something new that's being tested in the Aklavik. So we're happy about that. The more emissions we and our less reliable we are on fossil fuels. So I think that's a step in the right direction for conservation.
I do too. That's great. I didn't know about the Aklavik one. Thank you.